My husband's funeral was a quiet affair. Standing by the graveside, I received a text. "I'm alive. I'm not in the casket." I asked, "Who are you?" "I can't say. They're watching us. Don't trust the children." And then I learned the truth. Before we continue, I'd like to ask you to like this video. Thank you. And now enjoy the story. My name is Margaret Sawyer. I am 66 years old. And what I'm about to tell you turned my entire world upside down. The funeral of my husband, Ernest, was the quietest day in my memory, as if the very air in our small town of Spring Creek had gone still, and even the wind at the cemetery gate dared not rustle. We stood by the fresh mound of earth as the pastor read a prayer. Beside me, my sons, Arthur and Ethan, shifted their weight in black suits that looked as smooth and foreign as they did. Their faces were appropriately mournful, but their tears seemed to run on a schedule, and their hugs were cold. I was gripping the edge of a bench to keep from collapsing when my phone vibrated in my purse. An unknown number. I opened it and my knees buckled. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket." My fingers trembled so much I almost dropped the phone. "Who are you?" The reply was instant. "I can't say. They're watching us. Don't trust our sons." Everything inside me seized up. I looked up at Arthur and Ethan. They stood half a step away, serene, like men whose minds were already on business matters. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. It was an insultingly small crowd for a funeral. The pastor, myself, my friend Linda, Arthur's wife Jessica, and my two sons. For a man who had lived 70 years in one place, who had fixed everyone's bicycles, helped with odd jobs, and lent out his tools, the emptiness felt strange. "We didn't want to bother anyone," Arthur had said curtly when I whispered about the neighbors from the workshop. "Dad didn't like a fuss. Let's keep it simple." But Ernest had loved people. He loved to chat on the porch, to laugh, to reminisce about fishing trips. He would have wanted to say goodbye to them. I tried to listen to the pastor, but his words scattered in my head like water. My whole life with Ernest flashed before my eyes, long, even, and quiet like a country road. We had met when I was 24. A small town, dusty streets, a square with an old oak tree by the community hall. I was caring for my mother back then, cleaning houses part-time, and Ernest was tinkering in the workshop he had inherited from his father, fixing bicycles, sometimes tillers, his hands greasy, his smile shy. I remember the first time he spoke to me. It was a Tuesday. I was on my way to the market in a faded green dress and worn-out shoes. He came out to the doorway of his workshop, wiped his hands on a rag, and, as if apologizing, smiled. "Morning, Maggie. Need your bike looked at?" I didn't have a bike, of course, but I immediately came up with a silly excuse just to talk to him. And so it began. Whispers under the oak tree, the bench by the community hall, a promise for a lifetime, and a modest wedding where a tape recorder replaced the orchestra, and the neighbor's pies replaced a restaurant. The first few years were not easy, but they were bright. A small house, 2 rooms, and a tin roof. Basins in the corners for when it rained. We would laugh when it started to drip at night and run around rearranging the pots. Ernest worked from dawn till dusk. I sewed dresses and skirts for the women in town, hemmed coats, took on knitting. When Arthur was born, my heart was ready to burst with joy. His father's big eyes, my smile. 2 years later, Ethan arrived, just as handsome. On weekends, Ernest would take them to the river to fish, teach them how to hold a tool, and in the evenings he would read them fairy tales. I fed them, dressed them, stroked their heads, listened to their breathing at night, and it seemed that happiness was simple as bread, warm as a stove. Then they grew up. Arthur always had a bit of an edge, sharp, businesslike. He started asking early on why we lived so modestly, why we didn't have a car like other people. Ethan followed his brother like a shadow. When Arthur turned 18, Ernest offered him a place in the workshop. He pushed the toolbox away as if it were something alien and pressed his lips together. "I don't want to get my hands dirty, Dad. I'm going to be someone important." Ernest said nothing, but I saw him later, sitting on the porch, looking at the stars for a long time, quietly, with a kind of weary sadness. It was as if he had lost not just an assistant, but a whole language in which he had dreamed of speaking with his son. Years passed, and Arthur did indeed make his way to the city, got a job at a real estate agency in the county seat, and quickly rose through the ranks. Ethan, without much thought, followed him. The amount of money they had was incomparable to our income from the workshop and my odd jobs. First, I was proud. The boys had made it out, good for them. But then the joy somehow imperceptibly became as thin as paper. Fewer calls, rarer visits. They would arrive in their shiny cars, in their slim-fit suits, speaking in some foreign language. Deal, investment, property. They would look at Ernest and me as one looks at old things, familiar perhaps but embarrassing to have on display. "Mom," Arthur said one day, "you and Dad need to move somewhere more decent. This house is falling apart." He was right. The roof leaked more often, the stove was capricious. But within these walls our whole life rustled. The boys' first steps, late-night talks, thousands of simple dinners. It was a humble home to anyone else, but to us it was home. Ernest, as always, said it quietly and accurately. "Maggie, our boys' money has spoiled them. We don't fit in with them anymore." I argued with myself. I made excuses. "They're busy, they have no time, they're young." I waited. "They'll sort themselves out, they'll settle down." But somewhere deep inside, I already knew we were losing them. I just didn't know how much yet. When Arthur brought Jessica home to meet us, everything became clearer. She got out of the car on stiletto heels that immediately sank into the dirt by our porch, in a bright red dress that wasn't a dress but a statement. "A pleasure," she said, smiling politely and offering the tips of her fingers. Her gaze swept over the house quickly like a scanner, and I suddenly felt embarrassed for our rugs, for our curtains, for all our simplicity. At the table she barely ate, poked at a meatball, picked at her mashed potatoes, took a sip of juice. Arthur, next to her, looked as tense as a guitar string, and kept apologizing for everything he had never apologized for before. "Next time we'll go to a restaurant," he whispered as if I couldn't hear. I heard every word, and every word stung. Ethan remained single, but he was putting on the same city skin. He would come for the holidays, always in a hurry, always an important call. He would answer right at the table, nodding into the phone, and then stand up. "Mom, I have to run. Early meeting tomorrow." Our family Sundays dissolved like ripples in water. New Year's became a formality. Expensive, unnecessary gifts. Conversations like a report. They would sit for 2 or 3 hours and leave with relief, as if they had done their duty. Ernest and I grew old together. He would stubbornly go out to his workshop, his hands no longer what they used to be, but with the same love for his work. I would sew out of habit, though my eyes were failing. We held on to our modesty, never asking the boys for a penny. And on dark evenings on the porch he would say, "You know, Maggie, the trouble isn't that they have money. The trouble is that along with the money, they seem to think that we are no longer important." As always, he was right. It wasn't about the dollars, it was about the heart. Then the business talks began. Jessica, on a rare visit, said evenly, "You should sell the house and move into a good nursing home. They have doctors and care there." Nursing home hit me like a slap. For 40 years we had been building this nest, raising our sons, saving so they would have better shoes, newer books. And now a nursing home. "We don't need a home," Ernest replied calmly, with that dignified directness that had always been in him. "We're fine here." But I saw my sons' faces. They agreed with her. We had become an inconvenience, a problem they wanted to solve. At Ernest's grave, the pastor finally fell silent, and the first clumps of earth hit the lid of the too simple casket. The sound was dull, final, and I barely managed to stay on my feet. Linda Peterson put her shoulder under mine. The phone in my bag vibrated again as if alive. I pressed it to my palm as if it were hot. "They will push. Take care of yourself." I read the words and hid the screen. "Mom, are you all right?" Arthur was by my side too quickly, too timely. I looked into his face as if for the first time. Everything was in its place, but not a single living feature. "I'm fine," I said and closed my bag. "I need to go home." The whole way home I repeated those 4 words to myself. Don't trust our sons. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke on me. But then why did every hug from them feel colder than the air over the fresh grave? Why did they rush the funeral, choosing the simplest things, as if in a hurry to be done with it? That evening, alone in the kitchen, which still smelled of black bread and jam, I laid out my life before me as if on the palm of my hand, from the faded dress at the community hall to this empty, too quiet funeral. And for the first time I allowed myself to think aloud. What if it's not just callousness? What if it's something worse? I didn't know then how far it had all gone. I was just learning to hear the truth in my own heart. But someone was already whispering it to me from the darkness. Take care, Maggie. Don't believe them. From that day at the cemetery, I could no longer look at my sons with the same eyes. Every mom hang in there sounded alien. Every move seemed rehearsed. They didn't surround me with warmth but with initiatives. A realtor would come by unannounced, taking pictures, measuring the rooms. An appraiser would peek into the attic, into the crawl space, jot something down in a notebook and leave just as quickly. In the kitchen, over tea, Arthur laid out the papers in a fan, neatly, beautifully, like a man used to bargaining. Mom, a smooth smile, a soft voice. I've done the math. Your house, well, it's worth $100,000 max. If we sell now at the peak of the market, I'll add some and you can move to a better place. It's more convenient. A doctor nearby, decent neighbors. $100,000 for the walls that had absorbed our entire life. I silently cleared the plates from the table. My hands were shaking so much that the spoons clinked against each other. Ernest had sat upright, as always, listening attentively without interrupting. And also, Ethan chimed in, looking at his papers so as not to meet my eyes, Dad should have left the workshop. It's dangerous. His age. It's time to rest. Working is not a punishment, Ernest had said, so calmly that the room became quieter. It's a purpose. Purpose. They didn't hear. They only heard the numbers. What's best for everyone, they would repeat as if it were a spell. Early inheritance, Arthur called it, smiling. Their parents were still alive, and they were already mentally dividing the spoils. We endured a few more such visits. One day, Jessica brought brochures for nursing homes, glossy with smiling grandmothers on the cover, and placed them next to my sewing patterns. They have meals and activities there, she said in her polite voice. You'll be more at ease. We are at ease at home, I had replied. We live here. When they left, Ernest had fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth for a long time, then looked up. There's something not right here, Maggie. They're in a hurry. Why, I didn't know. But a lump of anxiety had lodged in my throat, and no amount of water could wash it down. The last conversation with Arthur, which I still hear at night, happened 3 weeks before. He came alone without Jessica, sat at our old table where he had once eaten his oatmeal as a boy, and said without looking at me directly, Mom, whatever happens, Ethan and I will not abandon you. We will always be there for you. At the time it had sounded like a comfort. At the grave it sounded like a warning. Whatever happens, as if he knew in advance. On Tuesday everything broke. Ernest went to the workshop early as always. While it's cool, I'll work on the frames. He waved from the gate and I went back to the stove. Meatballs, mashed potatoes, his favorite. The phone rang so sharply that my heart skipped a beat. Is this the city hospital? I asked, though they were the ones calling. City Hospital number 1. A female voice confirmed. Are you Margaret Sawyer? Your husband has been admitted in serious condition. Come immediately. The world swam as if from the heat. I grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. The words wouldn't come. What? How is he breathing? But the voice on the other end repeated the same thing. Come. Linda Peterson drove me. I was shaking so much I couldn't hold the keys. The drive to the city was a blur. Windows, trees, bus stops. It was all like a bad dream. My sons met me at the emergency room entrance. I immediately noted. Too fast, too timely. Who had called them? Not me. Mom! Arthur held me tightly. They say something exploded in the workshop. Burns, a head injury. He's in the ICU. Ethan stood nearby, his eyes red. but his gaze was darting around, as if he were waiting for something, not afraid. A nurse at the desk explained evenly and routinely, "Next of kin, one at a time, no more than 5 minutes. Keep it together." I ran my hand along the cold wall to steady myself, and followed her down a corridor that smelled of medicine and metallic cleanliness. Through the frosted glass, lamps flickered, monitors beeped. My heart was beating so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I stopped at the door that said intensive care, took the handle and took a deep breath, like before plunging into icy water. The ICU was bright and cold, like a workshop where everything is iron and impartial. Ernest was lying under the machines in bandages, his face half covered with gauze, only his hand was free. I touched his fingers. Warm, familiar, mine. "Ernest, I'm here," I said quietly so as not to spill my voice. "Hold on, you hear me? Everything will be all right." It seemed to me that his fingers answered, a barely perceptible squeeze. His eyes fluttered under his eyelids, as if he were about to say something. I called the nurse. She looked at the monitor and nodded sympathetically. "It happens. Don't get your hopes up. Spasms." But I knew his hand. He was trying to reach me. For 3 days I practically lived in the corridor on a hard chair, dozing off, waking up to the beeping of the machines. My sons took turns on duty, but they were mostly near the doctor's lounge, catching doctors by the sleeve, whispering at the registration desk. Once passing by, I overheard a snippet. "Life insurance, 500,000. Accident up to 750. Who's the beneficiary?" The word beneficiary stuck in my head like a cold nail. That evening, Arthur sat down next to me and said, "Evenly, too evenly. Mom, we checked the documents. Dad has a policy for 500,000 and another one through Social Security. If it's a work-related accident, we can get up to 750. We need to get it all sorted out so you can be at ease." "I don't need money," I said, my eyelid twitching. "I need my husband alive." "Of course," Ethan nodded, but in his eyes a calculator was clicking away. "We'll take care of everything." On the 3rd day, an elderly doctor gathered us in his office. He spoke carefully, like to a person standing on the edge of the ice. "His condition is extremely serious. The head trauma is severe. There's an infection. We're supporting him, but the prognosis, the probability of him regaining consciousness is negligible. We can keep him on the machines for a long time, but there will be no quality of life." "Do everything you can," I said, and heard my voice as if from a distance. "Mom," Arthur began softly as in an ad about caring, "Dad wouldn't want to be a burden. He always said." "He's not a burden to you," I snapped. "He's your father." "We're thinking of you too," Ethan chimed in. "The bills, the expenses. It could eat up all your savings." Money again. Numbers over a human being. I walked out of the office and went to the ICU as if to a church. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, went in and took his hand. "If you can hear me, give me a sign," I whispered. A barely perceptible squeeze. Another one. A tiny wave under my fingers. I called the nurse. She just shook her head. "It happens." But I swore to myself, he's here, he's fighting. On Friday night, the alarms went off at once, like dogs howling throughout the town. Lights flashed, people ran. Someone's quick footsteps, a command, strangers' voices mixed together. I tried to rush in, but I was gently pushed aside, seated on a chair against the wall. Time fell apart. Then the doctor came out, his eyes downcast. At 4:37 a.m. "I'm so sorry." I slid to the floor and pressed my cheek against the cold tile. The world we had built over 42 years had collapsed quietly, without a sound, like a piece of furniture that someone had carefully unscrewed beforehand. My sons arrived an hour later, fresh, composed, as if for a meeting. Arthur had a folder with business cards for funeral homes, estimates, numbers. Ethan had forms, applications, the headers already filled out. "We've already made the arrangements," Arthur said quickly. "The simplest casket, a short service. Dad didn't like a fuss. And we've started the process with the insurance companies so that you—" He faltered, seeing my face. so that everything would be without any extra bureaucracy. At that moment, I couldn't argue. I was made of salt only to cry and dry up. But even through my tears, I noticed their strange haste. Who had called them in that first hour? Why had they appeared at the emergency room before I was even invited to see my husband? Why were they so confident with the doctors? The funeral was scheduled for Monday. Arthur, without consulting me, had chosen the simplest option. The neighbors from the workshop weren't invited. Why bother people? Everything went as was convenient for them, as if someone were checking off items on a to-do list. That evening I sat in the kitchen, staring at a cup of cold tea, trying to piece everything together into a coherent thread. The explosion in the workshop, the ICU, the talk about money, their rush, their confidence. Something important was missing. Some bolt was screwed in the wrong way. I didn't know yet that an answer was waiting for me that would make the blood drain from my face, and that in a few days I would start asking questions out loud, questions that would make the smiles on my sons' faces turn to glass. The day after the funeral, I took out a tin box of documents from the old dresser, the one where Ernest kept everything important: the house, the workshop, the insurance policies. I laid them out on the table, sat down, took a breath, and started reading the fine print, as if it were a stranger's life. The first thing I came across was the life insurance policy. I remembered the amount of the old one, just in case. But here was a neat addendum, with a stamp from 6 months ago. Insurance amount increased to $500,000. Ernest hadn't discussed this with me 6 months ago. Who had pushed him to do this? Why now? Below was another document, a very recent one, at most 2 months old. Insurance against industrial accidents, maximum of $750,000. Ernest had worked in the workshop his whole life, but he had never liked new paperwork. Paper will endure anything. And here were 2 large insurance policies, almost one after the other. A coincidence? After the last few days, I no longer believed in coincidences. The phone on the table vibrated, as if it had heard my thoughts. Check the account. See who withdrew the money. The same unknown number. I no longer had any doubts. These were not cruel jokes. Someone knew too much about us. In the morning, I went to our bank. A small room, familiar faces. The branch manager, Galina, came out of her office, took me by the elbow, and sat me down. Margaret, please accept my condolences. How can I help you? A statement, please. For the last 6 months, all transactions on mine and Ernest's account. She printed it out and placed the pages in front of me. I ran my finger down the lines, and the cold that had been in my chest since the day of the funeral spread wider. Over the past 3 months, someone had withdrawn large sums. 1,000 in January, 3,000 in February, 4,000 in March. I hadn't made any such withdrawals. Who received this money? I asked, my voice sounding foreign. Your husband withdrew it, Galina replied calmly. He came in person. He said he needed the funds for repairs in the workshop. I looked up. Can I see the signatures? She took out the ledgers. The signature was like Ernest's but shaky, alien. Ernest wrote evenly, confidently. That's how he would write me little notes on the refrigerator. Milk. And a funny smiley face like a little boy. But here it was as if it wasn't his hand. Did he come alone? I asked. Galina thought for a moment, squinting. Twice he was definitely not alone. With your eldest, with Arthur. He explained that he was helping his father with the paperwork. You know, it's hard without glasses. I clutched my bag on my knees so tightly that the clasp dug into my palm. Ernest never took off his glasses during the day. Hard without glasses. It sounded like a rehearsed phrase. My phone flashed again. I covered the screen with my hand, read the message, and it was as if I heard a restrained, firm voice. They forced the insurance on him. They convinced him it was for your peace of mind. It was a trap. I sat in the bank and for the first time felt not only grief. Something hot, stubborn rose in my chest, like a flame in a stove when you throw in a log. They were trying to lead me by the hand like a blind person, to a place where everything was quick, convenient, without any extra bureaucracy. Thank you, I said to Galina, neatly folding the papers. This is enough for me. Outside, it smelled of dampness and melting snow. I walked slowly to put everything in its place. The new insurance policies, the withdrawals, the signatures, the visits with my son. Whose plan was this? And where was the thread to pull to unravel the whole tangle? My phone beeped again, a short, sharp click. Go to Ernest's workshop. Open the top drawer of his desk. There's something in there you haven't seen. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. People were walking around me. Cars were hissing through the puddles, but inside me, everything had already taken a step in another direction, to a place where the answers are not pleasant, but they save you. The workshop door creaked just as it always had, but inside was not as it always was. It was too clean. It didn't smell of soot. Not a single smudge of soot on the wall. Not a single charred spot on the floor. The workbench was like a display, the tools were laid out in their places, the machines were in a neat row, the wiring was intact. I stood in the middle and caught myself with a ridiculous thought. If something had exploded here, where was the evidence? Where was even a single piece of melted plastic? Where was the twisted metal? And where is the exploded machine? I said aloud as if someone could answer. I went to the desk. The top drawer didn't open right away. It was stuck as always. Ernest had been putting off oiling it. Inside were pencils, a tape measure, an old calculator, a folder with papers, and an envelope with my name on it. First the papers. 2 sheets torn from a checkered notebook. Ernest's handwriting. Even firm recognizable. Arthur insists that I need new insurance for Maggie. It's for peace of mind. I have a bad feeling about this. I don't trust his words. Below, another day, 3 days before the hospital. Ethan brought some papers for modernizing the workshop. He's in a hurry, says it needs to be done right now. I don't understand what's in them. Why such a rush? I sat on the chair, which creaked like an old man. My fingers themselves reached for the envelope. It was sealed neatly, homemade with saliva like we used to send letters. On the front, Maggie, and a period. If you're reading this, then what I was afraid of has happened. Something is not right with our boys lately. They're too interested in money, insurance, the house. Jessica is egging them on. Yesterday Arthur said, "Dad, you have to think about safety. At your age, any accident can be fatal." For some reason it sounded like a threat. I love you. If anything happens, don't take anyone's word for it. Not even theirs. Check everything. Stephen Knight has agreed to help. I'll go see him again. My hands had gone numb, but I only realized it when the paper began to tremble. Ernest had seen everything, had felt everything. And I had closed my eyes so as not to be burned by the truth. I sat in silence for a moment, then carefully folded the pages back and put them in my bag. The workshop had become stuffy. In the evening, Arthur came with a bottle of wine and a smile that at any other time would have seemed like care. He didn't ask if he could come in. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass, and sat at the table where he had once practiced his penmanship. "Mom," he began softly, "I've thought everything over. The insurance payout is already in process. It will be $500,000. That will be enough for you to get settled properly, to buy a smaller, cozy place. Or maybe a good nursing home. You know, where there are doctors and care." "How do you know the exact amount?" I asked as if casually. "I helped Dad with the paperwork," he said without blinking. "I wanted to make sure you were secure. Ethan and I could manage your money for you so it works for you. There are so many tools now, investments, interest rates. We could multiply everything." Multiply. The word was as light as a soap bubble. I nodded so as not to spill what was already boiling inside me. "And how do you think it's best to spend it?" I asked, watching his eyes. His eyes flashed barely perceptibly, like a candle under the ceiling. "I would sell this house while the market is at its peak. You move into a clean, warm apartment. We'll draw up a power of attorney, and you won't have to think about anything anymore. Ethan and I will take care of everything, bills, insurance, repairs." "Give me time," I said. "I'll think about it." "But not for long, Mom." His voice became firmer. "It's important not to miss the moment now." When the door closed behind him, I sat in the dark for a long time. The wine on the table was untouched. The clock was ticking loudly, like on the night when the boys were born and I was counting contractions. The phone vibrated as if it had heard the silence. Tomorrow, the police department asked to register a report and to see the materials on the accident. The hospital has other reasons. There are contradictions. Don't believe the explosion version. I reread it twice, then again, and I knew that my morning was planned. And if I really wanted to see this through, there was no turning back. In the morning, I went to the police department, a familiar gray building with peeling paint on the railings. The guard nodded and asked for my ID. 10 minutes later, I was invited to see Major Miller, a sturdy, lean man with a direct gaze like a blade. "How can I help you, Mrs. Sawyer?" "I want to register a report," I said, folding my hands on my knees. "My husband died after an explosion in his workshop, but many things don't add up. I'd like to see the investigation materials." He called the on-duty officer, who brought a folder. The major flipped through it silently, then looked up. "We have no report of an explosion or an accident at your property. No one was dispatched. And frankly, given that you have no signs of a fire." The hospital said explosion. "My son's too." Miller sighed and opened another sheet. "According to the medical report, your husband was admitted unconscious with signs of toxic poisoning. The biochemistry shows traces of methanol. This should have been disclosed to you." He paused and added carefully, "There is a note in the chart. At the request of the next of kin, do not disclose details so as not to traumatize the spouse. Signatories, the elder and younger son." The words hit my temples. Not an explosion but poisoning. And the relatives had asked not to be told. My relatives. "We can start a preliminary investigation," the major continued. "But it will require a statement. And we will need all the documents, policies, statements, your notes. And be prepared for some difficult procedures. We may have to raise the question of an exhumation." "Do it," I said. My voice didn't tremble. "I'll bring everything." They were already waiting for me at home. Arthur and Ethan had come with Jessica. A package from the bakery, coffee of that particular brand, as they emphasized. Concerned faces, sweet smiles. "Mom, we're worried," Arthur began, looking around the kitchen like an inspector. "The neighbors say you're going around to offices, asking strange questions, not eating. Jessica brought your favorite eclairs." Ethan chimed in. "You'll warm up with some coffee. Your hands are shaking." I remembered the message. Don't take anything they bring. And how Ernest had suddenly had an explosion. "I've already had breakfast," I said and pushed the package away. "Thank you." Jessica smiled as if she hadn't heard. "You need to take care of your nerves. By the way, we consulted with a doctor we know. He says that after a loss it's common to have, well, distrust suspicion, especially in women your age. It's treatable. We're ready to help you organize care and observation," Arthur added gently. "There's an option. A good nursing home. Not by force, of course. Just think about your health. And it would be a good idea to sell the house," Ethan said, as if in passing. "The market is favorable right now. The repairs will eat up the money anyway." I looked at them, and in every phrase I heard not concern but haste. Their plans were rustling like papers in a lawyer's briefcase. "I'll think about it," I replied and looked at my watch. "But now I have some errands." They exchanged glances. I saw Arthur's lips tighten slightly, as always when he didn't get a yes immediately. "Don't take too long, Mom," he said. "These issues need to be resolved quickly." They left, leaving the coffee and the package on the table. I carefully, without touching them, put everything in a bag and took it out to the porch for the trash. The phone vibrated. "Margaret, this is Stephen Knight. Ernest contacted me 3 weeks ago, asked me to keep an eye on his sons. I have recordings and photos. 3 p.m. sharp, the corner cafe, the back table. Be alone." My heart beat faster. So this is who had been writing to me. Not some prankster, not a whispering neighbor. A man whom Ernest himself had asked for help. By 3 I was at the corner. A low ceiling, the smell of fresh pastries and chamomile. A display case with pies. I sat in the back corner and ordered tea. My palms were still sweating. A man in his 50s with a touch of gray approached without any fuss. A strict coat, attentive eyes. He placed a brown folder on the table. Mrs. Sawyer. I'm Stephen Knight. Please accept my condolences. Ernest was a decent man. I nodded. I didn't have the strength to say thank you. First, I have to warn you, he said quietly. What you are about to hear is difficult, but a bitter truth is better than a smooth lie. He took out a small voice recorder and pressed a button. Ernest's voice came through, warm, confident, familiar. Stephen, if something happens to me, it's not an accident. Arthur is pushing for insurance for Maggie, for her peace of mind. I found clauses in the papers where they win. Ethan is asking what I eat when I go out. When I'm at home, he says he's worried. I have a bad feeling about their words. I sat, gripping my mug with my fingers so I wouldn't spill my tea. The tears were flowing on their own, but I didn't wipe them away. I listened. This was a month before the hospital, Stephen explained. And this is closer to the event. Click. And I recognized Arthur's voice. Crisp, businesslike, dry. We can't wait. The old man is starting to suspect. Methanol works cleanly for me. It looks like a stroke or a heart attack. We'll take Mom then, she'll be in shock. We'll get guardianship and that's it. Something inside me clenched so tightly it became hard to breathe. Stephen didn't turn it off. A new recording. Ethan's nervous chuckle. Tomorrow Arthur will add it to the vitamins in his coffee. First a fog in his head, then his vision, then a coma. The life policy is for $500, the accident for up to $750. We'll close everything. Mom too. Later. Stephen stopped the recorder and was silent for a moment. I have photographs, he said and laid out the pictures. Your eldest is buying methanol at a hardware store on the highway outside of town. He's paying in cash, giving a false name. The date is 5 days before the hospitalization. In the photo, Arthur was at the door of the store in a jacket, with a small canister in a bag. Clearly, without any ambiguity. I felt cold in the warm cafe. And here's more. Stephen showed me some printouts. Financial movements for the last 6 months. Debts. The elder owes about $70,000 to a loan shark in the city, the younger $40,000 from gambling, plus a $50,000 transfer to the doctor who issued the death certificate. The money was in cash, but there's a chain. I'll trace it. Why didn't you go to the police right away? I whispered. Why wait? I needed medical evidence, he replied calmly. The death on paper was heart failure due to trauma. A voice recorder to the face is not enough. Now that there are traces of methanol in the chart, it changes things. And also, he looked up, they are going to see Judge Miller tomorrow at 10 to start the procedure for your incompetence. I intercepted the conversation. We don't have much time. I placed my hand on the table to stop the trembling. Then to the police today, I said. To Major Miller. Let them seize the recordings, order an expert examination. Everything officially. I'm with you, Stephen nodded. But before that, one last recording. You have to hear it. He turned on the recorder again. This time both voices even mundane as if discussing renovations. After the father, we need to take care of the mother too, Arthur said. The sound in my head became a thin ringing. I sat motionless and waited for the next phrase. The recording cut off mid-sentence. Then there was only rustling. I've had enough of that. That's enough, I said. Let's go to the department. We arrived at Major Miller's office in the evening. I placed Stephen's folder on the table. The voice recorder with dates, the printouts of calls, the photos from the hardware store, the bank statements, the copies of the policies, my note from the workshop, and Ernest's letter. The major listened silently, occasionally asking short, clear questions, making notes in his notebook. This is a difficult story, he finally said. But this is no longer a family dispute. It's a criminal matter. We'll register the statement now. We'll describe the recorder and the pictures. We'll seize them procedurally. Then the prosecutor. An urgent expert examination. On the medical side, we'll petition for an exhumation. Are you ready? I'm ready, I replied. Do everything as required. He called the prosecutor's office. The on-duty prosecutor arrived, strangely enough, quickly. A gray coat, tired eyes, but an energetic voice. Another hour was spent on protocols. I was asked to explain in detail who had said what and when. Stephen was asked to explain how he had obtained the recordings. I signed, put crosses in the margins where I was told. By midnight, they had motions for a search, for the seizure of phones, for an exhumation, for an arrest. We'll take them at dawn, the major said. So they don't have time to call anyone or destroy anything. And you try not to be alone and don't agree to any urgent meetings. I didn't sleep at home. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, listening to the rare cars swishing on the highway far beyond the town. At 6 a.m, Arthur called. Mom, come to Ethan's urgently. His voice was agitated but trying to be even. Something's happened. We'll explain on the spot. I'm on my way, I said and hung up. Only I was on my way not to them but to the kettle to pour myself another cup, to have something to do with my hands. An hour later, police cars drove down the street. I saw the flashing lights from the window. The phone vibrated again. Then again. Arthur, Ethan, one after the other. Insistently. I didn't answer. By 9 there was a knock on the door. On the threshold, Major Miller. We've got them both, he said, without going into details. The elder denied it at first, then when we played the recording he broke down. The younger one tried to run through the courtyard. We had to chase him for 3 blocks. We'll question Jessica as a witness. I nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I took a deep breath. Not joy, relief. As if a tight band around my chest had loosened for a moment. In the afternoon Jessica arrived. Without her stilettos, with swollen eyes, but still in an expensive coat. She burst into tears from the doorway. Mrs. Sawyer, please withdraw the statement. Arthur is not evil, he's just… We're in debt. We were under pressure. I asked him to, yes, but I didn't think. He poisoned my husband, I said calmly. And he was going to take care of me. There's nothing for me to take back here. She said something more, but the meaning was lost in my own inner roar. I walked her to the gate and bolted it. 3 days later, the court authorized the exhumation. A heavy foreign word. But I signed everything that was needed and went to the cemetery. Not to watch, no, just to be nearby. I stood at the gate while the special services vehicles drove in, holding Linda Peterson's hand tightly. Then there were laboratories, deadlines, paper pushing. The result came quickly by the standards of such cases. Methanol in the samples, a concentration incompatible with life. The doctor who had written heart failure had received $50,000 in an envelope. They found that too. He was arrested for forgery and obstruction of justice. The picture was coming together without any gaps. The case became high profile. The newspapers wrote headlines that made me sick. In the town they whispered. Some turned away, others, on the contrary, brought pies and said quietly, "Hang in there." I held on. In the evenings, I watered the flowers and washed the cups. In the mornings, I went to the investigator's office, answered questions, and signed more papers. 2 months later, the trial was scheduled. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, neighbors, former clients from the workshop, people I didn't know. Stephen sat next to me, his hand on the back of the bench so I could feel his support. They brought in my sons in identical plaid shirts from the detention center, their eyes downcast. My heart stirred with not love, with memory. But on top of the memory lay something that could not be undone. The prosecutor began evenly, without any embellishments. This is not a family quarrel. This is a plan. Calculation. A debt-driven motive, preparation, concealment. An attempt at the subsequent seizure of the mother's property. I request that the audio recordings be admitted into evidence. The results of the expert examinations, the financial documents. The recordings were played one after another. The courtroom became so quiet that you could hear someone swallow. When Arthur's voice came on, "After the father, we need to take care of the mother too," someone in the neighboring rows gasped. A woman covered her mouth with her hand and left. I sat upright and held my shawl on my knees so I wouldn't tremble. Then the forensic expert testified, calmly with charts without any scary words about methanol, about the symptoms, about why an explosion was out of the question. They showed photos from the workshop, a clean table, intact wires. My turn to speak came unnoticed. I stood up and took the oath as I had been taught. I told everything without embellishment. How his hands smelled of grease, how he taught the boys to hold a screwdriver, how they then became strangers, how I heard "I'm alive" at the grave, how I sat in the ICU, how the new insurance policies appeared in the documents, how you recognize your own son's voice and you can't get away from it. The defense attorneys tried to ask questions about my age, stress, suspicion, but their words broke against the recordings and the protocols. On the third day, the trial moved to closing arguments. The prosecutor said briefly, "Calculation, greed, cold-bloodedness." I asked that both be found guilty and sentenced accordingly. The defense lawyers talked about pressure from creditors, bad advice, emotions. I listened and thought, if it weren't for the numbers, the voice recorder, the work of the doctors and investigators, I wouldn't be here. The judge retired to deliberate. The clock ticked in the silence. Then the call. "All rise. The court is in session." The judge returned to the courtroom, followed by a clerk with a folder. I gripped the edge of the bench. Next to me, Stephen shook his head slightly. "Hold on. In the case of Arthur Sawyer and Ethan Sawyer," the judge began and looked at us, "the court has decided." I closed my eyes for a second and heard someone in the courtroom unable to hold back a sob. The judge read evenly, without any pressure, like a metronome. To find Arthur Sawyer and Ethan Sawyer guilty. The sentence is to be imposed for the aggregate of crimes. Deprivation of liberty for a long term in a strict regime correctional colony. The elder, life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than 25 years. The younger, 25 years of imprisonment. There was a commotion in the courtroom. I didn't cry. The tears had ended earlier. In the ICU, tired of the documents at the workshop door. Now there was only a quiet "finally" in me. Not joy, not victory, just an even silence in which I could breathe. After the hearing, people came up to me. Someone hugged me, someone whispered, "Hang in there." Linda Peterson was already crying with relief. Stephen held my elbow with his hand so I wouldn't stumble on the steps. Jessica had disappeared. They would later say that she had moved to the city and taken her maiden name. 3 days later, the final expert reports arrived. Everything that was already clear. Methanol concentration, time, signatures, money. $50,000 to the doctor for forgery. The chain was complete. I returned to an empty house, took off my black dress, and hung it in the closet. In the evening, I brewed a simple black tea and went out onto the porch. The air was thick with dampness, and in this thickness it was suddenly easier to stand on my feet. I said aloud, as if he were next to me, "Ernest, I did everything you asked. From now on, I'm on my own. Life doesn't rebuild in a day, but like water, it always finds its course." The insurance payout, the same $500,000 for which they had been in such a hurry, I transferred to a foundation that Stephen and I simply called the Ernest Sawyer Foundation. We helped those who had found themselves in a similar predicament. A free lawyer, a psychologist, a private investigator if necessary, so that no one would be left alone with the family secret. The first letters came quickly. "Thank you. Because of you I decided." I held these envelopes carefully, as I had once held the heads of my sleeping boys. I didn't sell the workshop. I took off the lock, took out the workbench, unscrewed the old shelves, and in their place I planted flower beds, dahlias, nasturtiums, then roses. The earth smelled like his hands had, of warm iron and sun. On Sundays I would go to the cemetery with a bouquet, red roses, white carnations, and I would tell him about my week. Who we had been able to support, who we had helped to get to the investigators, who we had simply called so they wouldn't be silent at the window. It seemed that the wind in the leaves was listening and nodding. Stephen would drop by on Wednesdays. We would drink coffee on the porch, discuss the foundation's affairs, argue about wording. I was learning to speak in an official language. He would laugh. "Maggie, you have such a voice." I just want to listen. No wording is needed. He became a dear person to me. Not a replacement, no. Nothing was being replaced. It was just that a person who had entered my life at the right time had stayed. About the sons, the letters from the detention center, and then from the colony did not come right away. At first from Ethan, rambling with pleas for forgiveness, with promises to reform, with empty circles of excuses. Then from Arthur, short even. Mom, I understood everything, but it was too late. A year later the news came. Arthur had committed suicide. No details. The prison warden reported it dryly. I sat on a stool and stared at one spot for a long time. I couldn't cry. Inside it was as empty as the deserted workshop. Ethan was later transferred to a prison hospital. Psychiatric observation. His letters came less frequently. They were confused. They smelled of medicine and despair. I didn't answer. Not out of anger, but out of a right to silence. Jessica, like water on glass, had flowed away and dried up. They said she had changed her job and her last name. I didn't look for her. In the town at first they whispered, turned away, some sympathized, some condemned. How could she? A mother against her children. Then they got used to it. The local newspaper published an article about the foundation, dry, without any sensationalism. One of the neighbors came to the garden with apples and said, "That's right, Mrs. Sawyer. A family is not a cover for villainy." I just nodded. Words still don't explain anything if a person hasn't experienced it themselves. One day, a woman of about 40 knocked on my door, sat on the edge of a chair, fidgeted with her scarf, then suddenly blurted out, "My brother, I think he poisoned our mother for the apartment. I'm scared." I heard myself in her voice, the first one at the cemetery gate with a trembling phone in my hand. We filed a statement. Stephen took on the investigation. 3 months later, her brother received a sentence, and she brought me a small bouquet and said, "You gave me courage. I'm not a hero. I just once refused to be silent." 5 years have passed since that day when I'm alive was heard at the grave. I am 71 now. My hair has turned completely white. My wrinkles are like threads on my palms. You can see where they were sewn, where they were ripped. I renovated the house quietly. A new roof, light yellow walls, the color Ernest loved. In the evenings, I sit on the porch, listening to the distant hum of motors from the road, to someone laughing in a neighbor's yard. Sometimes it seems to me that he sits down next to me, not for conversation, just to sit. And that is enough. Sometimes they ask, "Do you miss your sons?" I don't know how to answer briefly. I miss 2 little boys who smelled of milk and sun, who said "Mom" every other word. Those boys disappeared long before their father died. The men who took their place made their own choices. It's not my fault, but it is my pain. You can live with it if the pain has a meaning. My meaning is so that another woman is not left alone in her kitchen with her doubt. My moral is simple, not from a book. Blood is not an indulgence. Love is not about enduring. It's about boundaries and respect. If a person, even a relative, does evil, you cannot cover for them with family. And the truth, it doesn't always heal, but it always puts things in their place. On Sundays, I go to Ernest with flowers. On the stone is engraved, "Beloved husband, father who was betrayed, a man of honor." I stand, I breathe, I tell him about the foundation's new cases. The wind rustles the leaves as if nodding. That's the way, Maggie. And I return home alone but not empty. This is my new beginning. To live honestly, quietly, and on my own terms, not giving anyone the right to decide what my life is worth. Thank you for listening to this story to the end. Write in the comments what you would have done in the main character's place. Subscribe to the channel, stay with us, we have many more life stories ahead.